The United States is no stranger to controversial elections, starting with the election of 1824, where Andrew Jackson, despite winning the most votes in the popular vote and electoral college, lost because Congress decided to just say, nah. Or the elections of 1888 and 2016, where the winner of the popular vote lost the electoral college. Some of you remember the most recent election where there were allegations of mass voter fraud, which led to a storming of the Capitol building during the electoral certification ceremony on January 6, 2021. But what if I told you there was an election where the candidate who won the popular vote lost the electoral college? There were problems with the voting machines, and the election was literally decided by 537 votes. This video will discuss the king of controversial elections, the U.S. presidential election of 2000, an election which came down to 537 votes in
Florida, Florida, Florida.
Needless to say, this election was like a Florida man news story, but on a national level. Before getting into the dirty details of the vote counting in Florida, I just wanted to give a brief background of the 2000 election and the U.S. political ecosystem in the year 2000. The 2000 election pitted Republican candidate George W. Bush, the son of former President George H.W. Bush, against Democratic candidate Al Gore, who was also the sitting vice president under Bill Clinton. George Bush campaigned on being a compassionate conservative who would restore decency to the White House after the sex scandals of Bill Clinton in 1997.
I did not have sexual relations with that woman.
The issues he focused on were keeping taxes low and reforming the education system. The perception of George Bush was that he was well-meaning, but perhaps not fit to be president due to concerns that he owed his political career to his family name and to his dad being a former president, not because of his own merits. Al Gore, although vice president to Bill Clinton, wanted to distance himself from the scandals of the Clinton presidency. Bill Clinton rarely appeared with him on the campaign trail. For his running mate, he picked Joe Lieberman, a conservative Democrat who had been very openly critical of Bill Clinton. Al Gore's campaign focused on strengthening Medicare to pay for prescription drugs and paying off the national debt, with a detailed plan to do so by 2012. Gore wanted to cut taxes for the middle class, but have the rich pay higher taxes. People thought that Gore, while smart, was an out-of-touch elite who struggled to relate with and understand the concerns of average people. George W. Bush was the polling favorite for most of the year, consistently leading Gore in polling through the summer of 2000. However, Gore would rally and would start to close the gap later in the summer, and the polling would continue to narrow into the fall, leading people to view the election as a toss-up by Election Day. By November, there was an expectation that the election would be extremely close, and some even speculated that George Bush could win the popular vote while losing the Electoral College, which is ironic given what actually ended up happening. A lot of people correctly predicted that this election would come down to whoever won Florida. Now let's talk about election night. A lot of us in the year 2024 are accustomed to not knowing the results of some races on election night. But in the year 2000, it was the expectation that everyone would go to sleep knowing the results. As the results came in, the country saw many extremely close races across multiple battleground states. Bush would take New Hampshire by 7,000 votes. Gore would take Wisconsin by a mere 5,000 votes. But the belief was still that the election would be decided by whoever emerged victorious in the state of Florida, to claim the state's 25 electoral votes. Just before 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, right before the polls were to close in Florida, major networks projected from exit polling data that Gore was to win the state of Florida. This made many people believe that the election was over and that Gore had won.
Night, NBC was the first network to call the key state of Florida for Vice President Al Gore.
But over the next couple hours, the results coming in would strongly contradict the projections these networks had made. Bush was building a sizable lead in the state of Florida, which led to networks retracting their calls for Gore to win the state, marking the beginning of the giant controversy that would dominate U.S. politics for the next several weeks. By 2:30 a.m., the networks decided to declare that Bush had won Florida and thus the presidency. By this point, Al Gore had called Bush to concede and was planning to deliver a concession speech the next morning. But the remaining outstanding votes came primarily from Democratic Miami-Dade County. Bush's lead in the state narrowed significantly overnight and into the very early hours of the next day. This margin was small enough to trigger mandatory recounts of the votes, and this would lead to Gore calling Bush to rescind his concession the next morning.
Nashville, a stunned silence has fallen over the crowd in Austin. Vice President Al Gore has called Governor Bush and retracted his concession because he is now of a mind that things could be turning yet again in Florida.
People would wake up the next day still not knowing who won, something that was unprecedented for the time. The day after the election, George Bush's lead in Florida would narrow to just a few hundred votes. This meant that the vote in Florida was headed to an automatic recount. As the entire country had put their eyes on Florida, the problems with voting in the state were brought into the limelight. One of the problems had to do with people being denied the right to vote. In the state of Florida, convicted felons are not allowed to vote. Months before the election, Florida Secretary of State Katherine Harris, the person in charge of running elections in the state, who also happened to be the chair of the Bush campaign in the state of Florida, removed thousands of voters from the voter rolls. The problem with this is that there was not much effort taken into account to make sure the people who were being removed from the voter rolls were actually the people who got convicted of felonies. Middle names were not considered, and many people were denied the right to vote simply because they shared a first and last name with another convicted felon. These people were wrongfully denied the right to vote, and they tended to be disproportionately African American, a group that votes for the Democratic candidates at around a 90% clip. The second and more famous controversy had to do with the method of counting the votes themselves. In some parts of Florida, specifically in lower-income precincts of Miami, votes were counted by punching a hole next to the candidate you wanted to vote for. These were done on what is known as a butterfly ballot. This system caused several issues. First, as you can see, it can be confusing to figure out which would be the correct hole to punch. Thousands of people who voted down ballot Democrat ended up casting votes for Reform Party candidate Pat Buchanan. It is believed, even stated by Pat Buchanan himself, that these people probably meant to vote for Al Gore. The second problem is that over 10,000 ballots in Miami-Dade County were rejected due to the hole not being punched through all the way. They would sometimes be partially punched or dimpled. These ballots were infamously coined dimpled chads or hanging chads. These ballots tended to be cast in lower-income precincts that voted favorably towards Democrats, while wealthier precincts tended to have more modern, state-of-the-art methods of voting that was less prone to this type of error. All of these issues led to the Gore campaign requesting a hand recount of all the votes, and thus the beginning of a chaotic several-week process that some have described as a street brawl for the White House. The recount process was, well, let's just say it was very controversial. The controversies start with the fact that the governor of Florida at the time was Jeb Bush, George W. Bush's brother, who you may remember from the 2016 Republican primary.
Please clap.
While Jeb being the governor of Florida may not have actually been as consequential to the final result as people thought, it served as a symbolic image to what is often remembered as a stolen election. The much more consequential figure when it came to deciding the outcome of the recount process was previously mentioned Florida Secretary of State Katherine Harris. To preemptively clear up some confusion, let me explain to you what a Secretary of State does at the state level of government. I would imagine most of you are familiar with the Secretary of State, who is the head of the State Department and leads U.S. foreign policy. But at the state level, the Secretary of State has nothing to do with foreign policy. The job of a Secretary of State is to be the head person in charge of administering statewide elections. This includes races for governor, direct ballot initiatives, and presidential elections, to decide which presidential candidate will get the state's electoral votes. Katherine Harris was extremely close to the Bush family and also happened to be the co-chair for the Bush campaign in the state of Florida. Many would argue that Secretary Harris had a conflict of interest between impartially performing her public duty as Florida's Secretary of State and helping the Bush campaign win the state of Florida as the co-chair of the campaign in the state she serves. Katherine Harris would be accused of doing several things that people felt was trying to hand the election to Bush. This included the wrongful deregistration of voters sharing the same first and last names as convicted felons mentioned earlier, but would also include several attempts to try and stop the recounts before any new tabulations might put Al Gore ahead in the state of Florida. Many would argue that this election was won and lost by how each campaign strategically maneuvered through the weeks that followed Election Day. Because the post-Election Day tally had Bush up by a few hundred votes, the goal of the Bush campaign was to stop any recount that could potentially put Gore ahead. Likewise, the goal of the Gore campaign was to try to make sure as many recounts in favorable precincts as possible took place so that Gore could take the lead in Florida. Shortly after Election Day, the Gore campaign would propose a hand recount of all ballots in the state, which the Bush campaign would reject. Miami-Dade County, the county that had the most issues with rejected ballots in the state, decided to proceed with a hand recount of all the votes to correct for any votes that may have been missed by the machines. This would result in Republican operatives, most notably Roger Stone, coming down to Miami and setting up camp in order to lead Republican operations in the state. The Republican operatives were much more willing to take to the street and weaponize civil disobedience compared to the Democrats. An example of this is when Reverend Jesse Jackson tried to organize mass protests in Miami on behalf of the Gore campaign. Gore personally asked him not to do so, as he thought it would be damaging to the legitimacy of American democracy if people viewed the outcome as Gore forcing his way into the White House. The Republican strategy was to try and stop the count. One of the key tactics that Roger Stone and the Republican operatives decided to pursue was civil disobedience in order to intimidate local officials. There would be an organization of many mass protests where "Stop the count" would be chanted. The messaging from Republicans was that the Democrats were trying to steal the election, and many comparisons to Fidel Castro's Cuba were made in order to exploit the trauma many Cubans in Miami had towards the government they fled from. The most famous act of civil disobedience, organized by Republican operatives, was the Brooks Brothers riot. This took place at a meeting of election canvassers who were performing a hand recount of votes on November 19, 2000. On the surface, this riot seemed like an organic gathering of aggrieved citizens, but we would later find out that the vast majority of those who participated in the riot were actually Republican operatives and staffers who had flown down to Miami from Washington, D.C., and the entire event was organized by Roger Stone. This riot would be successful in that it scared the canvassers into stopping the recount midway, and the board would vote to halt the recount entirely the day after the riot. After multiple decisions by the Florida Supreme Court that ordered the recount to continue in Miami-Dade, the U.S. Supreme Court would intervene on December 12th and order that all recounts be halted due to a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. This was a 5-4 decision that was split completely by partisan lines between liberal versus conservative justices. The conservative majority issued an opinion which stated that the recount was in violation of the 14th Amendment because Miami-Dade's recount did not include all precincts, and that the Florida Supreme Court did not specify who would recount all of the ballots. They also made a point to include that this decision should not be used as a precedent for any future electoral disputes that make their way into the federal court system. This Supreme Court decision would result in Bush winning the state of Florida and the 25 electoral votes that come with it, putting him at 271 electoral votes, one more than the minimum required to win the presidency. This would mark the fourth time in U.S. history where the winner of the Electoral College would lose the national popular vote. While it is still an unknown who would have won had the recounts continued, there's a strong belief that Gore would have prevailed. Ultimately, we may never know, and the 2000 election remains one of the most controversial and consequential elections in American history. Thank you to everyone who watched the entire video. If you liked what you just watched, please subscribe to the channel and thumbs up the video. I plan to keep producing more history content.